Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much to the presentations I've heard already. It's great to hear the threads of similarity throughout the different projects so far. My name is Paula Banks, and I'm employed with the Champagne-Ajac First Nations. And part of my job here today is just to introduce you to my cohorts and to place you geographically and also jurisdictionally our project for you. Sheila Greer, Kathy Bell, and also Heather Jones from Carcross-Tagish First Nation, who's with us. So you see in green the Yukon in the northwest of Canada, where we are located. And oh, she's okay. Okay. And this is the location. We are located in the southwest of the Yukon, Carcross-Tagish First Nations, Champagne and Ajac First Nations, of which Sheila works with us as well, and Ta'ang Council, based in Whitehorse, who weren't able to be here today. Jurisdictionally speaking, the three partner First Nations that are involved are self-governing. We have a self-government agreement and a final agreement. And our Champagne-Ajac, those have been in place since 1995. And Carcross-Tagish First Nation and Ta'ang about 10 years after that. And so that sorts out some of the jurisdictions that we're dealing with. Within what's called the final agreement, or it's also called locally the land claim, there are settlement lands apportioned to the First Nations, and specific responsibilities in terms of what kinds of laws and rules you can make on those, both on and off settlement land. So even lands that your First Nation doesn't hold, you also have responsibilities and jurisdictions and influence beyond that within your traditional territory. And specifically, our project deals with Chapter 13, which is our heritage chapter. And it is a chapter that's, I guess, a Western, I guess, based in Western thinking, and related to the ownership and control of heritage resources, and what the First Nations responsibilities are, also the Government of Canada responsibilities, and the Yukon Territory. Those are the three parties to our agreements. Also issues of consultation and information sharing. And the difficulty within our chapter, it does talk about definitions of heritage archaeological resources. It also includes that the management be consistent and respect the Yukon First Nations culture and values. And that's a difficult part because it's not defined what those things are. And since the chapter itself is conceived within a Western framework, and some time ago, the thinking has advanced since then.
Now it's my turn.
Do you want to? And if I've missed anything, please, my partners, jump in.
It's a real pleasure for me to be working up in the Yukon. As Paula set out, our work is within the context of Chapter 13 of the land claim, which actually divides ownership and control between the Yukon government and Yukon First Nations, depending upon the nature of the item that we're talking about, as well as its location. So what we are engaged in is really three areas. One is to define the rights and obligations in relation to heritage resources under Chapter 13. One is to look at what this means to us in terms of directing care and stewardship over heritage resources, and the other is to compare some of the YFN and mainstream Canadian legal and government understandings. Now, what's missing from this little diagram here is there's three contexts within which we're doing this research. The first and main context that iPinch is funding is exploring Yukon First Nation law, culture, and values around ethnography, and also understanding some of the terms and really unpacking those preambles that are in the land claim and getting a sense of what that means in contemporary Yukon society, engaging both the youth and the elders. We also have to look at Yukon government policy ethics. So we're looking at the federal level, the Yukon level, and the YFN level in terms of what this means in interpreting the agreement, but also in heritage management practice. And then we also have to look at it in the context of Canadian law. And some of the questions that we're looking at from the legal context are, what are some of the interpretive principles that inform the land claim process? How do we interpret how do we take this in light of new developments that recognize the honor of the Crown and obligations of consultation, which are now being read into modern land claims? And also looking at objects and preambles of legislative instruments and the role that they play in terms of bringing more of the Yukon values into the interpretation of this legal document. Some of our specific research goals are set out here. Specifically, we're looking at documenting Yukon First Nation values regarding heritage and heritage resource management. We're looking at tangible and intangible meanings and practices and the role that peoples, places, things, and activities of recognized heritage value have, both in cultural identity and cultural sustainability. We're comparing Yukon First Nation and mainstream Canadian legal and government understandings of what these agreements might mean and how we might move more towards Yukon understandings, Yukon First Nation understandings, in a way that recognizes also the interest of the Yukon government and the broader Canadian state. And also specifically to help provide direction on stewardship for these self-determining First Nations who have more control over these areas, I should say, than other First Nations, and certainly all First Nations south of the 60th parallel in Canada. And all of this is being done within the notion of a land claim and a self-determining First Nation is driving us. Now, we just got started. We did have our first workshop up in the Yukon with some of the heritage management and staff workers, and we have a few findings from that to share with you, and I'll turn it over to Sheila. And I will carry on.
Thank you. That's good. So, right, so what we put up here, just some initial thoughts, and it's one workshop, and with the group of us and Mark from Quachan, essentially heritage staff. And I have to say, this may be new to many in the audience, that Yukon First Nation governments employ people, and these are governments, they function, they have different departments. And so there's functioning heritage programs which would have a mandate, you know, yearly work plan, all that kind of stuff. So our first work session was sitting with a group of staff who have been working anywhere from 5 to, I don't know, 15, 20 years with Yukon First Nation governments. Anyway, some things coming out. So very clear, all of us were on the first one, engagement with citizens, families, clans. It's really central to everything that's at the basis of Yukon First Nations heritage management. We also came across, clearly recognized that the heritage practice, the practice of doing it respects family and clan connections. And so we also noticed it was commonly reactive, meaning we get a request about something, we provide insight on something, like the Western way maybe of taking care of something, and then it would be reflected in the family context. But we've recognized that there's clearly defined clan and family responsibilities for some forms of heritage, and that the First Nation government, as a government, is reluctant to interfere with. And of course, a really obvious one is the gravesite issue. Unless it's a really old gravesite where the family connection is not known or not active, or the descendants, or family has moved away and living outside the traditional territory. Another one that I'm sure is really familiar to other practitioners, that the process of what you do, is perhaps more important than the what of heritage resource management. Connections are really, really strong theme. Connections between generations, connections with the ancestors, and it's connections between people, places, and things, and really are the foundation of what we get directed to do as governments. And things like the value of old things and old places may not lie necessarily in the age, and something being 6,000 years old, or 4,000, whatever the case may be. But really what comes back repeatedly for us is the context and relationships between people, place, things, activities. This is the place. I collect berries here, and my grandmother collected berries here. And of course, things of stories, life stories, collective knowledge, this kind of stuff, they certainly bring value to place. And when it comes to the contemporary heritage resource management context, which tends to give precedence to things, material culture, stuff, old artifacts, so that of course produces situations of conflict between these two different value systems. So again, it's just a list of some points, not conclusive, but just sort of thing. So
we're already learning lessons.
Yeah, lots of lessons, yeah.
Sorry, and yeah, we're down to our last 2 minutes, perfect.
Okay, you want to go, Kathy?
Go, Kathy. This is going to come up a little bit more in the presentation this afternoon. But part of what we were exploring in this workshop was not only testing our question sets and trying to find the appropriate language while at the same time gathering some information from the heritage workers, but we were exploring what some of our core ethical principles and values were that we needed to inform the research process. And we are having challenges of reconciling our consent practices, and I'll give an example of that in the afternoon session. And part of the consenting practices problems arise from concerns over institutional liabilities and, of course, the two-page forms that we've just had to sign. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And we've also been looking at some of the challenge of finding appropriate terminology. Sheila is the lead on the project in terms of overseeing the research and the ethnographic work. And so old places, old things, trying to find ways to communicate particularly to the elders that we are going to be working with. Did you want to add to that at all on the question of respect?
Oh, well, I think it'll come up in the discussion this afternoon, so maybe we can do it then.
Okay, we'll do it this afternoon. That's perfect. Next steps, we've developed a research guidebook because we'll have different people doing this work in different communities. We are now working on a focus group with the broader Yukon First Nation Heritage Group, which includes heritage staff of all the other Yukon First Nations. We'll be working with elders and youth. Legal research has already been commenced on interpretation of the land claims and how that's changing in light of new laws that have emerged in Canada since, well, recent 2000s. And yeah, case study presentation to the Yukon First Nation partners will be next. So that's where we're at.